Michael.
Well, thank you, Jackie. And good morning, everybody. And thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Michael. I'm proudly serving as your CEO, and I hope you're all healthy and well. This week is actually National Volunteer Week, and so I want to start off by recognizing and thanking all of our amazing volunteers. We're so grateful for what you do, and I know that many of you are on the webinar today, so thanks so much to the volunteers. It's my great pleasure today to help host our second webinar, and today's topic is a really important one: rare species of the Niagara Escarpment. And with the help of our amazing members, donors, and supporters, we're working hard to secure habitat for many of these species at risk. So thanks to every single one of you for your support. It really does matter, and it really makes a difference. And I have the easy part. I have the great pleasure of introducing our panelists today, and I'm also lucky that I get to work with these individuals every single day. So I'm going to introduce Brian Popelier first. Brian works for the Bruce Trail Conservancy as the Land Stewardship Coordinator, where he utilizes and builds on his years' experience to perform ecological inventories on over 13,000 acres of BTC managed lands and prepares management plans for BTC properties, as well as supporting BTC clubs in stewardship, encroachment, and ecological issues. Brian holds a Bachelor's in Science of Environmental Science and Biology from Trent University, as well as certificates in ecological land classification, bird and plant identification, butternut assessment, Ontario pesticide forestry licensing, and Ontario wetland evaluations. He can often be found in the forests and watersheds of Ontario, hiking, fishing, and taking great pictures. He also enjoys camping and just being out in nature. So thank you and welcome, Brian. And Adam Brylowski has been with the Bruce Trail Conservancy for over 10 years, helping to manage the land stewardship program. Adam has a background in urban forestry and ecological restoration, a Bachelor of Environmental Studies from York University, and a grad certificate in ecosystem restoration from Niagara College. Prior to working with the BTC, Adam worked with the forestry department at the City of Toronto as a natural resource management technician, as well as an organization called Urban Forest Associates that worked to restore degraded natural spaces in Toronto. So you can hear from those introductions that we absolutely have some experts to help us walk through this presentation. So thank you so much, Adam and Brian, and over to you.
Thank you, Michael. Welcome, everyone, and I hope you're happy and healthy. And I hope you're ready for an exciting journey down the Bruce Trail to look at our species at risk and other sensitive species. So the Bruce Trail, we provide ecologically sustainable public access to the Niagara Escarpment. So the escarpment is home to many sensitive species, some of which are actually globally rare. The thing is, we have a 1-hour presentation. There's so many rare species, unfortunately, in Ontario. So we're going to go through and we're going to cover just a few of those that you can actually see when you're hiking the trail. So there are 2 organizations that designate species at risk. There's the Committee on the Status of Wildlife in Canada, or short, COSEWIC, or the Committee on the Status of Species at Risk in Ontario, and for short, COSERO. So a sensitive species is one that has been deemed by either the federal, provincial, or municipal government to be rare in a given region. So based on the number of reports that species gets in that particular region. So there's 3 descriptions or designations given to species at risk. You have special concern, which is a species has characteristics that make it sensitive to human activities or natural events. A threatened species is a species that is at risk of becoming endangered if the limiting factors are not reversed. And endangered is a species facing imminent extinction or extirpation if we don't do something to save that species. So I will mention extirpation basically means that a species once resided in Ontario and now it is no longer in Ontario anymore, but it could be somewhere else. So a good example would be the timber rattlesnake. Back before, excuse me, European settlement, timber rattlesnakes were found in Ontario, but once the European settlement started to come, they were prosecuted because they were a venomous snake. So they are no longer in Ontario, but they do exist in the northern states. And extinction, I think everyone knows what extinction is. So once again, a good example of that would be the passenger pigeon. Once again, prior to the European settlement, there was millions of these birds. Apparently they would just block the sky. There was that many of these birds. But once Europeans came, they began hunting them, and with habitat loss, they actually became extinct. And extinction means it's found nowhere else. It's off the planet. So that's not good, and that's what we're trying to avoid. So those main three designations, the special concern, threatened, and endangered. So they are actually backed by the Federal Species at Risk Act and the Ontario Endangered Species Act. So these basically classify species as a species at risk and afford that species protection under these two acts. So the criteria for species protections they're laid out in both those acts as well. Each species that is designated under one of those categories, they actually get a recovery strategy or a management plan written by the federal or provincial governments. So these recovery strategies, there's an example of one. It's a management plan for the blue ash in Canada. So that's the federal management strategy. So they basically look at everything about the species. There's the scientific information on basically what habitat the species needs to thrive. It lists all the threats to the species or the ecosystem in which that species survives. So, and it also puts recommendations on how to protect and recover species and their habitats. It often looks at the area of critical habitat that species needs to exist. So critical habitat varies with each species. It could be a 25-meter area around a nesting site for a bird or a snake, or it could be a 200-meter distance around a vernal pool for, say, Jefferson salamander. So critical habitat varies with species. There are often severe fines, upwards of $250,000 or a year in jail if you are found to either harm or disturb a species at risk or its habitat. So it's important that we protect these species and follow it up with legislation. So often there's a lot of rare species in Ontario, like I said at the beginning. Many of them have not actually gone through the designation process yet because there are a lot, and usually they only pick 10 to 12 species per year to look at whether they're special concern, threatened, or endangered, because it takes a lot of work to assess a species. Often there's field work involved. Sometimes it takes a year or two to designate a species. So there are a whole bunch that aren't designated, but they are known to be rare in Ontario. So just the three species I have up, there's Virginia bluebells. That's the one, the nice blue-belled flower there. The middle one is green violet. That one is actually spotted on the Niagara Escarpment. It really likes the shallow soils of the escarpment. And then the nice yellow flower is roundleaf ragwort. So roundleaf ragwort I've only seen it up on the Bruce Peninsula, but it is very, very common up there. If you're walking on the trail, and it really seems to like the compressed soil compaction around the trail for some reason. But it's very plentiful up on the Bruce Peninsula, but it's really rare elsewhere. So we're going to walk through some other species that you might see. So the American chestnut, this tree is now endangered. It was once one of the most common trees in southern Ontario until the chestnut blight came over back in the 30s, or 40s, and it basically wiped out this tree because there's no cure for it. You'll often find that with some of our trees and shrubs, they're all starting to become under threat of these kind of alien or non-native funguses, insects coming over, and they're really affecting our trees. So the American chestnut, it's got nice glossy green leaves, you can see there. And if you look at the veins, at the tip of each vein on the leaf, there's like a little curved bristle. So that's a distinguishing characteristic of chestnuts. As you can see, the nut itself is surrounded by a really spiky husk, which is actually, if you grab hold of one of those, it can actually give you a little ouch. The bark is a dark gray brown, and it kind of cracks with age. So in Ontario now, these trees are typically don't get very big because as a sapling, the chestnut blight won't really affect it until it gets a certain size, and then all of a sudden the blight will attack the tree and kill it. So typically these trees, you'll find them in drier upland deciduous forest. They are tolerant of shade, and they're often found under the tree canopy, but they're found mostly in southern areas. There have been some incidences up in Grey County where they found a couple chestnuts, but generally they're a southern tree. We have on the Bruce Trail, our properties, we have one property that actually has several saplings. So it's really neat to see these things growing in a understory of a forest. Our next one is the butternut, one of my favorite trees. It loves the Niagara Escarpment for some reason. It really thrives there. I see these all the time. This is possibly one of the most numerous rare species that we have on Bruce Trail managed lands. Almost every property we go to, we find some butternuts. So it's hence why it's one of my favorite trees, because it's actually endangered. So it's really nice to see these trees in the wild. So it's endangered because once again it's a fungus called the butternut canker. So it affects these trees. It kills them within a number of years, and there's no cure for it. There's no treatment. Just once a tree gets the canker, you got to hope for the best and that it has some type of resistance. So very important tree to try to protect. So the butternut, it's got 11 to 17 leaflets, and the terminal leaflet is well developed. You can see in the picture. So the terminal leaflet is the leaf at the very end of the twig. The most distinguishing characteristic for me is the bark. In the picture you can see it's a light grayish bark, and it has flat-topped ridges. The fruit is a large nut, and it contains a single seed, and it's surrounded by a light green, sticky, fuzzy husk. So when you actually pick up a butternut, the nut is really sticky, and it'll actually stick to your fingers. Squirrels love these nuts, so it's very hard to find an actual viable butternut seed, because once they start dropping, the squirrels go crazy. Typical habitats, so yes, like I said, this tree is found all the way from Niagara Falls, all the way up to Owen Sound. It loves the escarpment forests. We actually very seldom are they found on the Bruce Peninsula, so it's possible that might be getting up to its northern range. So the butternut is very similar to the black walnut. So another name for the butternut is white walnut. So they're in the same genus, so they're related. The butternut, like I said, has that big terminal leaf. So if you see in the picture with the leaves, the black walnut has a smaller terminal leaf, or it might not even have a terminal leaf on the end. The nuts in the middle there, the butternut is more of an oval, elliptical shape, and the black walnut is more round. So I'm sure everyone's familiar with the black walnut. They seem to be everywhere, although they are currently as well under threat by something coming up from the States. So the bark, the butternut has that flat ridged grayish look, whereas the black walnut has more of a ridged structure. So that's the basic ways to tell those two trees apart. Okay, our next one, Eastern Flowering Dogwood. This is a beautiful, beautiful tree. As you can see by the flowers, very, very large, very showy, just a beautiful tree. The bark is once again very diagnostic. It's almost like it's in little cubes all the way along the stem there. Once again, you're gonna find, I repeat myself, this shrub is under threat from a blight, and the blights are not native to Ontario. They came over with all our globalization that's happening. We get more and more invasive blights and insects and stuff that comes over here and affects our native trees and shrubs and plants. So the blight for the dogwood, there's no cure. Once again, there's no way to really treat it. So we just got to hope that these species have some sort of resistance, or evolve to have some sort of resistance. Typical habitat, you'll often find these in the understories of deciduous woods. They like floodplains, they like slopes, bluffs, and ravines. It's more of a Carolinian species, so you can find it mostly from Niagara Falls to Burlington. You won't really see these trees north of Burlington. And our next one, American ginseng. This is also endangered. So as you can see by the pictures, it has kind of like compound tooth leaves that are arranged in whorls. So they have 5 leaflets. It's really, really similar to wild sassafras, if you've ever seen that. They have the ripened berries. They're in a tight cluster, and they're kind of reddish in color, and they're held above the actual leaves. And the flowers, as you can see in the picture, very nondescript, little tiny white greenish flowers, and kind of like a round umbel that are also held above the leaves. So the importance of this plant is it has traditional medicinal value. And it's known over the world that the root, a lot of people use it for certain medicinal purposes. So this plant is really poached. Being as it's endangered, it's illegal. It's protected under the federal and provincial government. But because it has a lot of value on the black market, a lot of people poach this plant. And when people poach, they don't care how much they take. They'll take the entire plant. If there's 200 plants in one area, they will take every plant and they'll sell it on the black market. We have a few properties that we have this plant on, but we will never tell you where it is. If you ever find American ginseng, don't ever let anybody know that you found it, except for BTC ecologists. Yeah, you can tell us, because you can trust us, and we'll go out and confirm its location and try to protect it as best that we can. The flower is found in moist deciduous woodlands. So once again, it loves the escarpment forest, and it's distinctive of undisturbed and high quality habitat. You won't find ginseng where there's been any type of disruption in the ecosystem. It really likes to be alone in the forest, untouched, and just it's a great looking plant. When you find it, you get really, really excited. Often Adam and myself, when we find these rare species, you maybe hear a little shout, a little scream of joy, because we get very excited when we find this stuff. So this plant is found from all the way along the escarpment, from Niagara to Tobermory. Like I said, it's endangered, but we have seen quite a bit of it. But you just got to make sure that it's protected and you don't tell anybody. So I mentioned it's similar to wild sarsaparilla. So there you go. You have the picture of ginseng, and then you have the sarsaparilla to your right. So they are similar, but they're different. As you can see, the two bottom leaves on the ginseng are smaller than the three top ones. And in sarsaparilla, the bottom leaves are either larger or the same size as the upper leaves. Which it's actually a good thing that ginseng is confused with sarsaparilla, because a lot of people will walk by it and not even recognize it. So, American hartstongue fern. There's several ferns in Ontario that are species at risk or species of conservation concern. This is probably the one that most people recognize, and it loves the Niagara Escarpment. In North America, Ontario probably has the most populations of American hartstongue fern because of the escarpment soils and the crevices and the boulders. You'll find this plant growing in amongst all that habitat with anywhere where there's calcareous rocks or boulders, shallow or deep crevices under a nice full deciduous forest. It seems to like forest of maple and beech combined. For some reason, the soil chemistry that those trees help with really allows this fern to thrive. I'm probably sure everyone maybe know this plant, but there's the picture of it. And so it's a perennial evergreen fern. It has strap-shaped fronds with a little heart-shaped base. It is said to be shaped like a deer's tongue. And another word for deer in Europe is hart. So hence the name hartstongue fern. So the species that we have here in Ontario is called the American hartstongue fern. There's also a European version of the hartstongue fern that's very plentiful over in Europe and England. The green dragon. So it's not a scary plant, even though it's called a dragon. It's a species of special concern. So it only has one leaf. So if you notice on the picture there, it looks like it has several, but has several leaflets, but they're all off of one or two leaves. So if you turn your palm, if you look at your palm, that's kind of what the leaf pattern looks like on this plant. It has a separate flower that is on the very bottom. So if you look to your left, that's the fruit pod that comes from the flower. So we call that like a long-tipped spadix or a floral spike, and that's where the name comes from for this plant, the dragon's tongue. So its ripened berries are red and orange in color, very, very visible when it goes to fruit. It likes moist deciduous floodplain woodlands, shady seeps and wooded areas adjacent to springs, creeks, and vernal pools. So it's once again, it's more of a Carolinian plant, so it's found in the southern parts of the trail, so Niagara to Burlington. Very, very similar to the green, or to the Jack in the Pulpit. So I think everyone's familiar with Jack in the Pulpit, but there's just a slide showing sort of the difference in the flower structure. And Jack in the Pulpits have 3 leaves, whereas the green dragon has 2 that are separated into 5 leaflets. So now I'm going to throw it over to Adam, and he's going to talk about some of the other rare species on the Bruce Trail.
Thanks, Brian. Hi, everyone. My name is Adam. I'm the other ecologist at the BTC. And I'm going to talk about the animals, the rare animals that we'll find along the Niagara Escarpment and the Bruce Trail. So we're going to start with birds, because birds are very important, and birds are actually a really good indicator of ecosystem or ecological health, because they're easily studied and they're generally abundant. In Ontario alone, there's 500 bird species, and of those, there's 291 that breed in the province alone, of those, 41 of them are considered species at risk. So 3 of them that we typically see along the Niagara Escarpment are the ones that are listed here: the eastern wood pewee, the wood thrush, and the red-headed woodpecker. And all of these species are actually experiencing declines, which has led them to become species at risk. For the eastern wood pewee, it's for all of them, it's mostly habitat that's degraded, and it's infringed upon, making woodlots smaller, turning forests into small woodlots, and creating edges actually decreases the amount of available habitat for these species. The eastern wood pewee is it's called an aerial insectivore. And aerial insectivores include swifts, swallows, flycatchers, and nightjars, kind of like whippoorwills and other type of nightjars. And it's globally shown that these species are declining. It's not entirely clear what the reasons are, because there's variances in the decline. So one species like the eastern wood pewee could be declining in this part of Ontario, whereas a different species could be declining in a different part. So it's not universal. So the science is still up in the air as to why aerial insectivores are declining. But the general consensus is that there's just not enough insects, because of development, because of our urban expansion and whatnot. The wood thrush, same thing. It likes large tracts of forest, so urban expansion is greatly affecting it. But another interesting thing that's really affecting it is brown-headed cowbird nest parasitism. So the brown-headed cowbird is actually a native bird species, and it's very unique because it doesn't create its own nests. It doesn't build nests. It only parasitizes existing nests. So they generally tend to nest along the edges of forests. So cutting forests into small chunks increases the area that they can go in and parasitize other nests. And what they'll actually do is go in to a nest. Wood thrush are one of their favorites, and they lay an egg. That egg hatches before all the other wood thrush babies. And brown-headed cowbirds have actually adapted to be very, very aggressive when they're young. So they can push out the smaller fledgling birds of the existing nest and take control. And what ends up happening is these poor wood thrushes will feed the brown-headed cowbird babies, and that reduces their viability. Red-headed woodpeckers, they've declined more than 60% in the past 20 years. And the reasons that we're thinking about that is because of, again, industrialization, urban development, but also the removal of their habitat in the form of dead trees. Woodpeckers are cavity nesting birds, and they feed and live in pretty much dead trees and big holes in existing trees. So by removing dead trees, you're removing their habitat. So on Bruce Trail Conservancy managed land, we try to conserve all of the dead standing trees that we have, unless they're a hazard for trail users, because they provide excellent habitat for species like the red-headed woodpecker. So just to give you a little bit more insight, the eastern wood pewee, it's a species of special concern in Ontario, as is the wood thrush, as is the red-headed woodpecker. So they're all species at risk, and they're all special concern. Thanks. So in Ontario, there's 17 species of snake, and of those, the only existing venomous one now is the Massasauga, which is something that we see on the Bruce Trail all the time. They're not as threatening as you may think. They're actually very shy, and they're a lot smaller than you would anticipate. You know, the kind of just the length of your forearm, that kind of thing. And they're very shy, so they don't want to go anywhere near you. They will use their rattle to let you know that they're really close by. You're looking for that rattle really when you're trying to identify them, and also their pupils, just like any other venomous snake, they have slits in them that are different from other snakes. And the pattern is sometimes confused with the milk snake, which is the bottom left picture. The top picture is the rattlesnake. Milk snakes have a very interesting adaptive strategy where they've mimicked the tail movements of a rattlesnake. So if you threaten a milk snake, it could use its tail to flick around, and it flicks leaf litter, and it mimics the sound of a rattle. And that's one of the reasons they've been persecuted, because they've been misidentified as rattlesnakes. But the good news with the milk snake is that it's actually no longer a species at risk in Ontario. So preservation and conservation work has been on the up, and this is no longer listed. The last snake I haven't spoken about here is the eastern ribbon snake, which is special concern. You can find it all the way along the Niagara Escarpment, and it looks very similar to a garter snake, but it's just a lot more streamlined, a little sleeker, and it has a distinct white crescent in front of its eye. You can see the picture, it's a little small, but the bottom right picture, it shows the eastern ribbon snake. And one thing that I always look for is really clean lines in the jaw. Garter snakes have a lower jaw that's yellow, but the yellow kind of diffuses into the top part of the head, whereas the ribbon snake has a very clean, distinct jawline and that crescent. So these are all species at risk snakes that we find on the Niagara Escarpment quite often. Moving on from snakes, we're going to get into some grassland birds. So grassland birds are they are birds that have taken advantage of large open grassy habitats. And in the case of all of them, they've started to adapt to agricultural uses like hay fields. Actually, the bobolink wasn't native to Ontario, but in recent years, in the past 200 years, as we've opened up the forests for agriculture, they've come in and they've sort of adapted. But one of the problems that's happened recently with these grass nesting birds is that the industrialization of farming has caused earlier and earlier haying times. So the farmers are taking the hay off as soon as they can so they can get more than one crop. And that kills the baby bobolinks that are using these meadows and hay fields as habitat. So it's very unfortunate. We do have agricultural land on Bruce Trail managed land. And what we do is we impose a limitation on the haying time. So we do not allow any haying until the 15th of July, which allows enough time for baby bobolinks and eastern meadowlarks to fledge and leave their nest, which greatly increases the viability of that species. So the bobolink is threatened in Ontario, as is the meadowlark, and the grasshopper sparrow is special concern. Another thing I should mention about the bobolink is that it's got a very characteristic call. It sounds like R2-D2 from Star Wars. So if you're ever walking along the Bruce Trail, along the edge of a field, and you see a little black bird that's hovering around that sounds like R2-D2, it's a good chance that that's a bobolink, because there's really nothing else that sounds like it. So turtles. In Ontario, there's 8 species of turtle, and they are all species at risk now. And the reason for that is generally, again, more urbanization. They're really prone to road mortality because they're so slow. And some turtles, like the snapping turtle, they like to lay their eggs on the shoulder of roads because of the gravel, which is what they're used to laying their eggs in, that kind of gravelly dirt. And unfortunately, they get hit when they're trying to do that. So every single one of these turtles is actually now a species at risk. Here are some pictures of them. I'll see if I can get them all right here. So the top left is a snapping turtle. The second one over in the top is a painted turtle. Then we have a map turtle, a spiny softshell turtle, which is my favorite one because it looks like a pancake. And they can go really fast, the spiny softshell turtles. If you've ever seen a video of them, they can scoot around like a little submarine, so they're great. Then you have a Blandings turtle bottom left, a spotted turtle, a musk turtle, and then we have a wood turtle, which is something that I've never seen, and I look forward to seeing at some point. Another limiting factor for turtles is that it takes them a long time to get to sexual maturity. So a snapping turtle and a Blandings turtle will have to live for 20 years in order to reproduce. So the trick is getting to the age of 20 without dying. And what we do at the Bruce Trail Conservancy is try and protect wetlands so that we can allow these species to thrive and route the trail away from any sensitive areas or turtle habitat that we've seen. Moving on from turtles, we'll get into butterflies here. And the monarch is probably one of the most iconic butterflies. It's special concern in Ontario, endangered in Canada. And it's something we typically see throughout the summer. Brian and I see it all the time, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's abundant, because its population has been declining significantly. A large part of that is habitat destruction, and particularly habitat destruction down in its the wintering grounds down south. So if we're looking to identify this species, you're looking for the sort of orange and black wings with the white spots along the edges of the wingtips. It likes meadows, fields, fence rows, gardens, and as you probably know, it needs to lay its eggs on common milkweed. And that's because the milkweed is the only species that the caterpillar will feed on, the monarch caterpillar. One of the problems we have here is an invasive species called dog strangling vine that is in the same family as milkweed, but it doesn't provide good nutrients for monarch caterpillars. So the monarchs confuse dog strangling vine with common milkweed, lay their eggs, and then the caterpillars starve because they can't survive on that. There's an interesting study here on a different butterfly that looks similar to the monarch called the viceroy. Now the viceroy is on the right, and I'll just leave it for a second and see if you can spot the differences. What we're really looking for is the back wings and a line. There's a black line that goes along the back of the back wing, and that and the size of the viceroy are the two things that really distinguish it from a monarch. And the reason that the viceroy looks like the monarch is just so it's mimicking a species that's poisonous. Because the monarch butterfly feeds on milkweed, it tastes very bitter to birds. The viceroy has adapted to look like the monarch so that the other birds will think that it's gross to eat. A big difference, though, is that the caterpillars of these two species look very different. The monarch, if you've ever seen it, beautiful looking caterpillar. It almost looks like a candy. It's black and yellow striped with little antennae at the ends, whereas the viceroy caterpillar actually looks like a bird poop. So it's quite different at the caterpillar stage. And butterflies are pollinators, along with bees, flies, beetles, wasps, ants, and moths. And I'll add hummingbirds in there as well. Pollinators are incredibly important because they are the things that help plants grow. So a plant needs to be fertilized by another plant of its species in order to produce flowers and seeds, and the cycle of reproduction will continue. Bees are probably the most well-known pollinators, but they're not the only ones. There's a whole series of flies and ants and moths and beetles that are also pollinators. Well, one of my favorites is American ginger, which is a native wild plant, and its flower actually sits on the ground, and beetles go into the flower and feed on pollen, and then they continue on to the next one, and cross-pollination occurs. So there's a whole world of pollinators out there. In Ontario, there's 400 different bee species, and these are native bee species, not the honeybee, the European honeybee, which has been introduced. 400 different species of native bee, and that includes 16 bumblebees, 3 of which are species at risk. Well, let me just go back here. So again, pollinator is incredibly important just for getting things going, getting nature moving, and yeah, keeping things going. So moving on from pollinators, we're going to get into the Jefferson salamander, which is one of my favorite species that we find along the Niagara Escarpment. This is a mole salamander, so it spends most of its time underground, and it loves the cracks and crevices of the Niagara Escarpment. It has to overwinter below the frost line, so it comes out only in the springtime, sort of late March, early April, during the first rain of the season, and when there's still ice on the ground, and it breeds. And then after that, it goes back down underground, and it is just completely unseen for the rest of the year. um, if you've ever uncovered a log as you're walking along the Bruce Trail, you've probably seen a red-backed salamander, which is the most common and abundant in Ontario. But there's also a variant of red-backed salamanders called a leadback that looks similar to the Jefferson salamander because it's all gray. But don't be confused. Jefferson salamanders are much bigger. The redback salamander in the lead phase is quite small and slim in comparison. We've actually done some work with the recovery team on the Jefferson salamander to try and confirm whether or not they exist on our property. And we have found positive results on some of our properties in the Speyside area, which is great for us. The difficulty with Jefferson salamanders is that some of the females have adapted to be able to breed without any male influence. So they can create genetic clones of themselves. And what this does is dilute their genetics. So they're not breeding, and the embryo doesn't have two sets of genetics. So it's diluting the gene pool, and that becomes difficult in terms of keeping the species genetically pure and true to the Jefferson salamander. So we can find these mostly in Carolinian forests. They need vernal pools in order to survive, and vernal pools are just sort of areas where a big puddle has formed and it stays up until summertime. And this is important because there's no fish. So fish would eat the salamander eggs. So they need to have habitat that's completely devoid of fish in order to survive. Great little guys. So if you're walking along the Bruce Trail and you find a sensitive species, what do you do? Brian touched on this a bit earlier. If you find a really, really sensitive species, you have to be very careful about who you talk to about it, because some people are interested in poaching. And we've heard all kinds of horror stories about this. So what you want to do is you want to take a picture, take as many pictures as you can of the leaves, of the buds, of the stalk, of the habitat. If you have a GPS on your phone or with you, mark the location, and then contact us, the ecologists, because we'd be happy to help identify it. And if we do find out that it's something that's rare, then we'll take the right steps, contact the provincial government, and help with its protection. We do have a citizen science program that uses iNaturalist, and that's something we can get into maybe in a different session. But iNaturalist is a great tool. It's an app that you can download on your phone, and it helps you identify species. And you can upload your species, keep a score, or keep a list of things you've uploaded. We have our own Bruce Trail section on there, so feel free to use iNaturalist. But again, do not take note of any rare species like ginseng, because that's something that you could be giving to the poachers if they know where the location is. So we've mentioned a couple different species, but all in all, we have 83 different species at risk that we've observed along the Bruce Trail, and there's over 1,500 occurrences of those particular species. So just the handful that we've talked about today is a drop in the bucket. On the 13,000 acres of land that we manage, we're always on the lookout for species at risk. And what we do to protect them is essentially create conservation land. So Brian and I, when we acquire a property, a Bruce Trail property, through generous donations, we go out and do specific 3-season inventories in order to catch all the species on the property. And particularly, we're looking for rare species, so we know where the trail should go, where it shouldn't go, and what measures we need to do in order to protect them. For example, removing invasive species around a particular type of species, rare species. Those are always factored into our management decisions. This here is a poster that actually was featured in a Bruce Trail magazine and annual report. And most of these pictures are species at risk that Brian took. He's an accomplished photographer, but they're all found on BTC land. And we're very proud of this because it's sort of a great representation of the conservation work we do and what's directly being impacted by development along the Niagara Escarpment. I'm going to pass it back to Brian to answer a couple questions that have come in before this presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. That was great. So I hope everyone enjoyed our presentation on some of the rare species that you can see on the Niagara Escarpment and the Bruce Trail. So we have some questions already sent in to us, so we're going to go through these and answer them. If you have any other questions, just please type them in the chat section, and then we will answer those after. So the first one, so let's please talk about why we need to protect the Jefferson salamander and about salamanders in general. So I think Adam already spoke to that, but it's really important that we protect, that all native species are protected because they all have a role in our ecosystems of Ontario. So when you lose one species, you'd be amazed of how it affects all other species within its ecosystem. And it's not a good effect. If we lose one species, the negative kind of snowball that starts to roll, that starts to outreach and affect, 3 other species, 5 other species, 6 other species. It could even affect the actual habitat with the loss of a species. So protecting Jefferson salamander is very important. Protecting all our species at risk is very important. And to be honest, protecting all our species, whether it's rare or not rare, is a very important aspect of what we do and what we will continue to do. The next question, so which ferns are considered rare? So I spoke about the American hartstongue fern, just because I think that's the one that people recognize the most. But there are several other ferns in Ontario that are either considered species at risk or they haven't been assessed yet. So there's a little tiny fern, it's called Walrus spleenwort. You find it up on the Bruce Peninsula. It grows in crevices, on boulders, on big boulders along the shoreline. It's just a beautiful, delicate little fern. We've seen it 3 or 4 times on our properties, and it's just a treasure when you find Walrus because it is really small. So it's almost like a treasure hunt when we're looking around on a boulder. You see both of us crawling around looking for this little tiny fern. There's a Laurentian fragile fern. Another rare fern, really likes the escarpment. This one's a tough one because it's very similar to 2 other species of fragile fern and bulblet fern. So sometimes when you're looking at these species, it's really hard to differentiate them from other species because they're so similar. So the Laurentian fragile fern is one of those species that is probably more common, but because it's so hard to identify, it kind of becomes put on the rare species list. Purple stem cliffbrake. This is another neat little fern. Really likes the Bruce Peninsula. Likes albars. Sometimes if you find that shallow pavement with no soil on it, you'll find some of these purple stem cliffbrake in the crevices. It's very, very common on like I said, albars, and Manitoulin Island has a great population of purple stem cliffbrake. And then the last one would be broad beach fern. So once again, this is a tough fern because it looks a lot like another fern, and the characteristics to differentiate them is a very, very, very small. So those are the rare ferns that we're looking at. So another question, so has COVID-19 affected the bird population? I'm pretty sure you might have seen on the news all these reports of all the fauna is starting to come out, and you see kangaroos in Australia running down the street, and there's sheep in Britain just hanging out by people's houses. So I would think it has affected them because we're all social distancing and we're in our homes, so there's not as much disturbance out there. Like I said, there has been some anecdotal evidence of the wildlife being more active. Whether it's going to be like a concrete answer is not really yet known. So I'm sure that there's lots of studies taking place at the moment, and there'll be maybe down the road we'll have some answers on how this affected. It's definitely a short-term effect, but whether once COVID's done and we kind of go back to normal, who knows if it's going to be any long-term effect. So the next question, considering there's a 50% decline in wildlife populations, as per the World Wildlife Fund, isn't it time that as stewards of this ribbon of wilderness, we protect wildlife by banning dogs from the trail? So on the Bruce Trail, on our BTC managed land, we don't allow dogs off leash on BTC lands. So anytime there is a dog on the trail on our lands, it should be controlled by the owner. We really don't have jurisdiction on other lands where the trail crosses, so that's up to the individual landowners. But I do know a lot of people don't want dogs off leash. So if a dog is controlled by its owner and it's on a leash, there really shouldn't be that much of an effect on any wilderness or wildlife in the area. So we'll go to the next page, and I'll throw it over to Adam to answer these ones.
Hello again. So the question we got was, hawks congregate around Beamer in the spring, Beamer Memorial Conservation Area, which is in the Niagara area. Which hawks do not migrate, or does it depend? And a similar question was, are any hawks presently endangered? We have red-tailed hawks all year in Oakville ravines. There's a nesting pair right now outside my window. Thanks. Well, yeah, most hawks migrate, but certain species do stick around. The red-tailed hawk and the American kestrel have been observed to stay in Ontario over winter because there's just enough food sources for them. In general, though, raptors, and there are 15 species of Ontario raptor, and there was a rare species, the bald eagle, but that has been uplisted. I believe it's special concern in Ontario still, but it's making a drastic incline in population, which is a real good news story for conservation. We do find bald eagles on some of our properties up in the Bruce Peninsula area. And here in Hamilton, where the Bruce Trail offices are, there are nesting bald eagles. So on the way to work, sometimes I see a bald eagle or a couple of them flying over my car, which is really, really exciting to see in Hamilton. Next question is, when surveys or searches are conducted, I'm assuming ecological surveys, are landowners notified if a rare species on their property, or is this kept internally to protect the species in question? So we, as BTC ecologists, we really have jurisdiction only over the land that the BTC has purchased or that we manage on behalf of another organization. So we don't generally look for rare species on land that isn't ours. Having said that, if it's something that we were to find, we would inform the landowner, and that's it. It's their land. The Bruce Trail is an interesting experiment because a great deal of it goes over private land, just because the landowner has been generous enough to allow it on their land. So we would share anything with the landowner themselves, and that's about it. If it was something that was very, very rare, like ginseng, we would stress that we should talk to the province, the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, in order to protect this species. The next question is, what types of owls are common to see here or rare to see here? So there are 10 Ontario owl species. The two species that are actually rare in Ontario are the barn owl and the short-eared owl. The rest of the species are not rare, but they're really cool. So the common species that we'd find here would be the great horned owl, which we've seen on a couple of our properties, screech owl, the saw-whet owl, and the barred owl. Those are the species that are probably the most common, although they're not easy to see because owls are nocturnal. So in the daytime, it's generally difficult to find them. A great time to go out looking for owls is late February when they're breeding. It's the breeding season. Where you can go on an owl hike and you do that a little bit after dark, and you're really listening for the owls because they're calling in order to attract mates. And I won't get into all the calls now, but they're all very distinct, and I would encourage everyone to learn their owl calls. So I'm going to pass it back over to Brian to finish off the questions and the presentation.
Thank you, Adam. So any observations on bluebirds? So bluebirds are another good news story. They were once a threatened species back in the past, but because they're such cute little bluebirds with a nice little orange belly, there's a lot of attention brought to their decline. So many people began erecting like nesting boxes because bluebirds are cavity nesters. So a lot of times, they'll use empty like holes in trees to raise their young. But with a lot of habitat loss and destruction, I think a lot of their nesting sites were starting to go away and be destroyed. So many people began making these artificial nesting boxes, and their population really rebounded once we started to do that. And so bluebirds are really quite common now. We see them a lot. This land stewardship department at the Bruce Trail, we have a nesting box program. We build and install nest boxes all over the place, whether it be for bluebirds or wood ducks or other cavity nesting birds. So what species are extirpated from the southern regions of the trail, but are still present in the northern regions? Well, this question is pretty easy. Most of our big carnivores, that would be the answer to that. Prior to European settlement, we had black bears down here, mountain lions, wolves, but with a growing population in this area, through the history of southern Ontario, that has really driven those large carnivores back up north to where there's a lot more habitat for them, because they need like large tracts of forest for them to survive, and it's just not available down here anymore. So that's it for our questions that were sent in. So I think we probably have a few over the presentation.
Hi, Brian and Adam. Thanks so much for a great presentation. You did a fabulous job, and I know we all learned a lot. There's actually 20 questions, so I'm going to do my best to go through them all. If we don't get to any specific questions, we'll send out information. You can actually email Brian and Adam directly, and I know they'd both be happy to help answer any questions from our members. So that's a resource that we have sort of year round that we're very, very grateful for. So I'll look for themes in these questions, but the first one that came in were, how many new species are emerging, if any, and what type of ratio to disappearing species would there be? So Adam, Brian, any thoughts on that?
It's an interesting question. So I'm assuming the question means, are there new species being created now through crossbreeding, cross-pollination? And if that's the case, that is a great question. I don't know if either of us are up on the scientific literature enough about that, but I can say that there are a number of species. The one that comes to mind, the hawthorn, that has completely changed because of European settlement. there was, I think, maybe 12 to 14 species of native hawthorn, which are those shrubs with the giant thorns on them that I'm sure everyone's familiar with. There was 12 to 14 species before European settlement, and Europeans brought in another dozen or so of these species. And what ended up happening was they cross-pollinated and created completely different species. So now there's actually more species of hawthorn in North America than there were in Europe and North America combined before. Do you have anything to add to that, Brian?
No, I think you answered it perfectly.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. The next question I've got is from Jim Oliver, and he's asking, I'm under the impression that the designation of butternut was downgraded from endangered to threatened. Can either of you speak to that?
Yep. Maybe we'll alternate the questions, Adam, and then that'll make it easier.
Sure.
Yeah, actually, with the butternut, it's opposite. It was threatened, and then it went up to endangered either last year or the year before. So the butternut is actually an endangered species now. So yeah, it hasn't improved.
Okay, great. Thank you, Brian. Adam, I guess this next question would be for you, and it's from Terry, and it says, how long is a Jefferson?
How long? Let's see. I'd say about 5 to 6 inches long, and fairly stout or thick in the middle. I can't think of anything to compare it to, but yeah, 5 to 6 inches long. So they're a fairly large salamander. When you see these little guys walking, they're very slow and determined, but they're huge. They look like a giant moving gummy worm or something like that.
Okay, that's great. Great answer. Thank you, Adam. The next question is from Susan, and it says, please talk about wild leeks in Ontario.
All right, Susan. Yeah, wild leeks, they're a common species, but they're really foraged. They're, unfortunately for the leek, they're delicious. And so people go out and dig them up. And right now is the time. Leeks are out in full force. So like the problem is people don't know how to sustainably harvest them. And that's when it's going to turn into a problem. Here at the BTC, we don't recommend foraging. We don't promote it. But, there's a big population in Ontario. So unfortunately, I can see down the road that it might become a problem and they might actually be listed at some point. I know in Quebec, they're a species at risk now because of foraging.
Okay, thank you, Brian. I've got a question from Sadhana Prasad that says, in Bruce County at our farm on the Saugeen River, we used to have bobolinks, but once we moved in, they left, even though we left the grasslands intact for about 2 hectares. What do you think happened?
Okay, so the first thing that comes to mind is that in order to have viable grassland habitat, you have to make sure that it's maintained. So any shrubby things that are growing or small trees are going to devalue the habitat for bobolinks. They really need open, grassy fields. So I would tend to cut it. The best thing to do to retain grassland habitat is to have a controlled burn, because you're releasing all kinds of nutrients back into the ground, but that is costly. So the next best option is to have someone come in and cut the field at least every couple of years. The other thing that comes to mind is that bobolinks need to have, it's said that they need to have at least 40 acres of uninhibited land, or uninhibited grassland in order to breed properly. We've seen them in smaller fields, but maybe just the 2 hectares wasn't large enough for the bobolinks to come back. But my initial thought is that maybe there's some shrubby or tree species that are growing up that are just preventing them from coming back.
Okay. All right, great. Thank you very much, Adam. Okay, the next question, I like this one. It says, where exactly can I see a butter tree? And that's from Phil and Kathy Kidston.
Where exactly can you see a butternut tree? Well, send me an email, and maybe one day when all this COVID stuff is over, if you're local, I can bring you out and show you one. Like I said, anywhere along the Bruce Trail, they really tend to love that escarpment habitat. So all I can suggest is go for a hike, get out there on the trail, maybe do a little Google search to really get the identification down, and look for that flat ridged gray bark, and eventually you're going to find one.
Okay. All right. Thank you. There's a question here from Christina that says, how can we encourage people to leave tree stumps and hollow trees on their property to provide space for birds?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's mostly education. Yeah, it depends on what people are using their woodlot for. So if you're using it just straightly for timber or for firewood, then that might not be something that you're concerned about. So it's people that aren't necessarily aware of the value that dead standing trees have. They're the ones that need the most education. We try to tell our trail captains and our land stewards, all the volunteers that work with us on the property that we manage, to leave all dead standing trees unless it's an imminent hazard to the trail and trail users. So yeah, unfortunately, education is the only thing that I can come up with to try and promote leaving these dead snags or dead trees for habitat.
Okay, great. And that's fantastic. Thank you so much. So we've got two more questions that we can kind of fit in, and the rest we will get to and reach out to you. But this question has to do with the pollinators, and it's from Katrina. And Katrina's asking, what can I plant on my balcony to help monarchs and bees?
Yeah, great question, Katrina. So pretty much, I always suggest, trying to plant native wildflowers. So butterflies and bees, they really like the showy flowers. So asters, goldenrods. Because you're on a balcony, you can go with more maybe like non-native cultivated flowers from a nursery. Just make sure when you purchase them, they're not invasive. But once again, like a showy flower, butterfly bush is a good one to attract butterflies. But a lot of pollinators, they've just really evolved with the native wildflowers. So, if you can get a few pots up there on your balcony and get some of those native wildflowers out there, that would be your best bet. And, the bees and the pollinators, they're waking up now too in the spring. So, maybe talk to the nursery about getting flowers that, some spring flowers that are going to flower now, some that flower in the summer, and then some that flower in the fall. So you have that, that whole array covering the whole season of flowering plants on your balcony to so our pollinators can have something to eat.
Okay, great. Thank you, Brian. And I'm actually going to two more questions. So this next one is for you, Adam, and it's, has there ever been a documented sighting of a cougar along the Bruce Trail?
There's been anecdotal reports of cougars along the Bruce Trail, but there's nothing that's been confirmed. No. So we suspect that there are cougars that are coming down from northern Ontario and increasing their range a little bit. And the Niagara Escarpment is a great wildlife corridor for them to sort of come down into southern Ontario through. But no, there have been no confirmed sightings of the eastern cougar along the Bruce Trail.
Okay, great. And then the last question is sort of thematic. There was a few people that asked generally these sorts of questions, but what resources are out there for our members in terms of books for identifying species at risk or plants or those sorts of things? So I guess Brian or Adam, can you maybe both take a shot at some of your favorite books for this type of work?
Yeah, sure. For me, for plants, there's the Newcomb's Wildflower Guide and the Peterson Wildflower Guide. Those are like the Bibles of plant field identification. They're both really well done. They have pictures with descriptions. The Sibley's Birds is a great resource for birds. The Owen Sound Field Naturalist, they have several publications that I highly recommend. They have one on asters and goldenrods, which is a tough group of plants to identify, but there are several rare goldenrods and asters in Ontario. They have one specifically on ferns, which is just fantastic. They have one specifically for orchids. We have a lot of orchids. We have over 40 species of orchids along the Niagara Escarpment, and a lot of them are rare because they're a very specific, delicate plant. And once again, some of them are hard to identify. So the orchid book from the Ontario, or from the Owen Sound Field Naturalist, is great. And they also have a specific book on rare species of Grey and Bruce County, which is a really helpful guide. So those would be my recommendations. So Adam?
Yeah, the only other thing I can think of, and this is a good tie-in to something I said earlier, is that we've actually put together a list of species for our trail workers. We call it the Trail Workers Guide to Sensitive Species along the Niagara Escarpment. And that's just picking out all of the major rare species that we may find along the Bruce Trail. And the reason for that was that earlier I mentioned that as ecologists, Brian and I don't have any jurisdiction to go onto private land and point out rare species or do anything that the owner doesn't want aside from the Bruce Trail. So we try to educate our trail captains on identifying rare species. So perhaps what we could do is make that available on our website, and that would be a great place to start, and then sort of dig in a little bit more with the resources that Brian suggested, which are all fantastic. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much, Brian and Adam, for answering those great questions. And thanks to all of you who sent in the questions. I know there was a few that we weren't able to get to, but again, we will provide information so that you can reach out to Adam and Brian directly. And it's clear that they're experts, and we'll be able to help for sure. Sincere thanks to every single one of you for being on this webinar today. I know we traditionally like to connect on the trail, but this is an exciting way for us to be able to connect with you, and we're grateful for the opportunity, and we're just grateful for your continued support. So there's a lot more webinars that we've got planned coming up, so we're excited to connect with you again. And thanks again to our panelists, and behind the scenes to Jackie and Megan for all your great work, and have a great day, everybody. Thanks so much.